Miss, the Trump presidency gives us more topics than we have shows that we can discuss those topics in, but yeah, sometimes we have to prioritize something even above the war, and this is actually a good news story, which is even more rare on this channel. Yesterday, the Court of International Trade, yes, I had to read that off the paper, uh, uh, basically blocked Trump's tariffs, and yeah, now he's in a position he's in a sense familiar with because he's had the courts block stuff that he's doing, but it was kind of on an individual basis, and in some cases he went ahead anyway. So there's this is interesting, and we don't exactly know where it's going, but we will try to see what this means, what it means down the line, what it means for an appeal, and so on. Welcome to the Daily Objective. I'm Razi Ginsburg. I'm joined by James Valiant, who usually joins me as my co-host on this show. Today, I think this is more like me interviewing you because you have the knowledge on this and I do not. So, do you want to give a better explanation of what exactly is going on than what we heard in my intro?
Well, it is, make a great point. This is the Court of International Trade. It's a court of very specialized subject matter jurisdiction that meets only in New York. And its special area of jurisdiction is international trade, customs, tariffs, things like that. The first version of this was created in around 1890, I believe, and then they revised it in 1980 and created what we have now, the Court of International Trade. It did not overturn all of Mr. Trump's tariffs. Mr. Trump has used other statutory means. Unfortunately, although the Congress has the power under the US Constitution, the exclusive power to raise taxes like tariffs and to regulate foreign trade, unfortunately, the Congress has given some of that power to the executive, beginning in the 1920s and revised in the 60s and so forth. There are other legal means by which Trump can impose tariffs, but those have to go through the Commerce Department. They're individualized. So the tariffs on, for example, steel, aluminum, and autos will remain in place. So not all the tariffs go away, and Trump may find a way through those more normal means he used in his first term and Biden used, by the way. So there are well-established means by which a president can do this. I myself oppose that as a violation of separation of powers, but we're not living in my fantasy world. But in 1977, the Congress passed the Internet, get this, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And it gave certain economic powers to the president in a time of emergency. Now, it's never been used to impose tariffs. Trump used this because there really, if you went through the normal process of the Commerce Department and these other statutes, it would have been a cumbersome and more difficult process. In order to impose the sweeping tariffs that he did on April 2nd, less than 2 months ago, mind you, that included the reciprocal, remember that big chart he brought out with all the different tariffs on all the different countries? That's the stuff that's been swept away. We've been liberated from Liberation Day. What an Orwellian term that is. So the 10% tariff that is currently being enforced, the reciprocal tariffs, all those tariffs on the various nations, also the tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China that were designed to coerce their behavior on fentanyl or immigration, those have all been swept away. The court held that Trump exceeded his authority under the 1977 Act, saying that, one, it does not grant the president, the power to set taxes and impose taxes on the American people. Only Congress can do that. If the Emergency Powers Act had done that, it's unconstitutional. But even just under the act, Trump far exceeded his authority. Under the act, they argued that, one, this is not an emergency. Two, even if it were an emergency, the actions that he takes would have to be tailored to solve the problem, the emergency that he declares. And three, that this was unprecedented and sweeping. It would in effect mean that the president has the unlimited power to set the rates, the tax rates on Americans, tariffs or tax on Americans, to set the tax rates. That really is the power of Congress. In fact, bills raising revenue have to start in the House of Representatives, and you'd be bypassing that whole procedure. So it's both a statutory interpretation and a constitutional interpretation case. It was very well reasoned. Several businesses, with the help of the Institute of Liberty and Justice and Professor Ilya Soman, filed suit. 12 different states, led by Oregon, filed suit. And so two different cases were basically combined. And we basically had two rulings even yesterday on the combined cases. So hooray. I mean, in my view, again, as an objectivist, I find the Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977 to be pernicious. And in my ideal world, it would not be constitutional. In my ideal world, even the standard assignment of tariffs to the executive through the Commerce Department would be unconstitutional as a violation of separation of powers. Well, we don't live in Jim's fantasy world, as I say. But what's really good here is that executive power in general was limited under this. Emergency powers were limited. A president can't just now that, like I say, the White House's position is really obnoxious. It says no unelected judges have a right to tell us how a president can deal with an emergency. So what he's saying, in effect, is that the White House's position is perfectly unreasonable. One, the president can declare this emergency, and two, he can define his own powers under that emergency without any judicial review at all. Given how well reasoned the court's decision was, and given how unreasonable the White House's position is, I think this case will, if I were to guess, will substantially be sustained on appeal.
Yeah. Now, of course, yeah, as you mentioned, even if it is, that doesn't mean it's the end of tariffs. It just means he'll have to go through what you said is a more cumbersome and tedious process, i.e., the legal one that he has to go
Right.
through,
The
through
existing
Congress.
legal process.
The one that is in line with the Constitution.
Well, what's
And
really
yeah,
great is that it pushes back on executive power grab
yeah.
that Trump is engaged in. But two, it also eliminates most of the sweeping tariffs that he imposed.
Yeah, and the
So
power grab, and the thing is, this power grab that Trump is engaging in, he's engaging in it across the board. Tariffs is one of the many examples. So this is pushback that maybe, maybe will have a negative effect on what Trump wants to do. So a positive effect on the U.S.
yeah, I mean,
and the
when
world.
the ruling that he seems to have ignored was a vague one. The Supreme Court's, reversed and in part and upheld in part that decision about the guy who was deported to El Salvador. But they couldn't make him do it, but he had to facilitate it. He didn't lift a finger to do it, but facilitate is vague. In this case, it's so specific. He really can't just ignore the court here. And as I say, I think that it will be, sustained on appeal. Now, I don't agree every time with the court in their, when they push back on Trump. For example, the Khalil case, what the judge said yesterday was perfectly partisan. That was under a 1952 law that Khalil was being deported. He's being offered all kinds of. They're in court this week discussing it. He's getting all the due process in the world under that law, and I think that law is valid and appropriate. And so when a judge disagrees with Trump, I don't always agree with the judge, mind you. But we do have a separation of powers in the United States where judges have an independent authority. The Trump is saying, I've got this, you're stepping on my powers as an executive. Well, of course, there's nothing in the Constitution that gives the president such powers, and we have a separation of powers. What he's arguing for is not separation of powers. He's arguing for, in effect, squashing any power that the judiciary has to review his actions under the law and the Constitution. So let me just say for the record, I'm not always against Trump on all these court decisions, but this is a decision I very, very much am excited about. I think it's largely sustained on appeal. It pushes back on the executive power grab that Trump is engaged in, and it gets rid of really the big, sweeping, pernicious tariffs, those reciprocal tariffs. And, he's suspended for 90 days so he could negotiate. But now a lot of what he's suspended for 90 days is now gone. What was being imposed right now was this 10% across the board tariff on nearly every country in the world. That's gone too. And he can't use tariffs to achieve some other end, such as, compliance for his demands on drugs and immigration. That's not within your emergency powers here, Mr. President. As I say,
Yeah.
it's not an emergency. And B, it has to be tailored, your actions have to be tailored to that emergency. The court made a
Um,
very careful and well-reasoned decision here.
yeah, and he has 10 days to comply, right? So we're gonna see we're gonna hopefully see that happen.
I don't think
Thank you,
he's,
Bonnie. Yeah,
yeah, I don't think he can wiggle out of this one.
I hope you're right. Thank you, Bonnie, for the super chat. Thank you, Jonathan, for the super chat. Jonathan says, I'm offended by tariffs in a free society. How you spend your money is not government's business. Your spending isn't a social lever to be pushed. Absolutely. And thank you, Wes, for the super chat. Three super chats from the US, tariff free still, although I don't think they have super tariffs on super chats, but who knows what the future holds. Yeah, but that's another thing that I'm wondering about, down the line. Let's say it's sustained and he has to go the actual legal route in Congress. You know, uh, will Republicans in Congress, pretend to be or stick? Well, they have no principles, so they're not. They sometimes pretend to be pro free market, but will they focus more on pretending to be pro market or pretend or saying yes to whatever Trump does? And will Democrats pretend to be pro free market because they're anti-Trump? Basically, we're our hope is not that anybody will do the right thing on principle. It's what wrong wrong basis will people have for maybe making the right decision?
That is the hilarious, triple irony effect of all of this. This powerful executive, this the regulate power to regulate economics and stuff, the power to impose tariffs. This is stuff that the left loves. The left gave us this powerful administrative state, and they don't particularly like the free market. In principle, that's the Democrats through most of my life who've been advocating for tariffs, and so it's really rich in irony from many directions. And of course, the Republicans are now basically in the Congress are basically now in Trump's pocket. Now, there was some members of Congress and the Senate who have expressed criticism of the tariffs. On the other hand, if he were to go to try and raise a new tax like a tariff through Congress, he'd have to, I believe, go through a Senate filibuster. And I don't think the Democrats, whatever they believe about tariffs or the powerful administrative state, I think they would filibuster it because it's Trump, just because it's Trump. And so you have this, like you say, we have this triple irony, and I think it was Kirk Wilcox on Twitter who said something really funny. Those damn commies, the damn commie courts supporting free enterprise and the Constitution. Right. No, that's traditionally the Republican position, but now we're going to hear Republicans talk about those damn commie judges. Like I say, one of the judges was appointed by Reagan, one by Obama, and one by Trump himself. So you can't really call this partisan, and it was not if you read the decision, not a partisan decision at all. It was right down the line and a very well-reasoned, sane one. And it was an assault on what Trump was doing on multiple fronts. So I think, and given Trump's unreasonable position, I think it will be sustained largely on appeal.
Thank you, Gail, for the super chat. Gail says, thank you so much for your expertise, James and ARCUK gentlemen. Thank you. In this case, it's James. I'm on this episode mostly here as eye candy, but yeah, and to ask some questions like, you know, um, yeah, emergency. I come from Israel. Israel has been in an emergency situation since the day it declared independence, officially and somewhat understandably. Uh, Trump likes this, being able to use this as as an excuse to do things that normally would not be done by the decision of one man in a system like the United States. Um, so yeah, is there basically going back to the question, is this going to have an effect generally on his ability to use executive powers, to stretch? And again, his predecessors have stretched it already, and he's just getting in at a spot where the question is, can it be actually stopped? And is he maybe taking it so far that it can have a uh,
Every,
counterproductive effect for him, so productive for the
God,
rest of us.
every president in my lifetime has increasingly used executive orders in an executive power grab when Congress was unable to provide the president what he wanted. Obama famously said, you know, at first I don't have the power to control immigration, and then later when Congress, it was obvious he couldn't get anything through Congress on that. He said, well, I've got a phone and a pen, meaning executive orders. And so when it comes to not in the, this does not impact the immigration cases, which is the other big bone of contention. But it will affect his ability to declare an emergency and just grab economic power. If what Trump wanted had been simply sustained by this court, we would have had, in effect, an economic dictator in the United States who could declare an emergency, define his own powers under that emergency, impose sweeping new taxes on the American people as a consequence. So what's good about this is that Trump's uh, economic power grab has been pushed back, and America has dodged the bullet, if this court ruling is sustained, of having a president who, in effect, can make himself economic dictator by declaring an emergency.
Um, okay, actually, I want to follow up before I go to the super chat. So, yeah, so the emergency here was basically the trade deficit. That was what was
Well,
supposedly.
with China and Mexico and Canada, he said we have a fentanyl crisis. And he also said with China and Canada and Mexico, you guys are not being helpful on immigration. Now, wait a minute. It's the United States government's job. If it wants to have a border, now that's unconstitutional in my view, too. But if the United States wants to have a border, it's up to the United States to do that. It's not Canada's fault or Mexico's fault, but you can't, but by using a tariff, an economic thing, does not really address those problems this court found, right? It's got to be a real emergency, one. And two, even if it is a real emergency, let's say fentanyl deaths are a real emergency. Tariffs are not a particularly effective way of doing that. It's not designed to actually deal with that, nor does it have any chance of really dealing with the fentanyl issue. Tariffs, and you can't coerce nations like that. In any event, using tariffs, they're completely unrelated things. So, yeah, that's the stuff that's gone. You know, what was they, 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico and China just for those issues? That's gone. The reciprocal tariffs that swept across these transnational tariffs on nearly every country on the globe, the reciprocal tariffs that he was arbitrarily putting in and then had suspended for 90 days while he negotiates, the 10% bottom line tariff that was imposed on all countries practically, that's gone. So all the tariffs that he announced on Liberation Day, we've been liberated from, in short.
Yeah, just to say transnationals are nationals, just making that point. Jonathan, yeah, not all jokes land. Thank you, Jonathan, for another super chat. Jonathan says free market society means free from government, not free to exploit others or do whatever you want to others. And Bonnie asks, only individuals should trade, but what do you call things like Trump's mineral rights deal with Ukraine or OPEC, etc.? I mean,
I call
OPEC
it
is
statism. I call it
okay.
socialism. That's
Yeah.
what I call it. Yeah. No, this is designed to be a tool in a war, in ending a war, protecting Ukraine. Again, you notice that how Trump really isn't very good at connecting the dots with his policy either. Unfortunately, I mean, in Atlas Shrugged, written by Ayn Rand, she has this wonderful moment at the end of the Atlas Shrugged where the judge in that, spoiler alert, yeah, where the judge in that case writes a constitutional amendment protecting the freedom of production and trade. Alas, America does not have such a doctrine. In fact, the Supreme Court in the 20th century has completely warped the Commerce Clause and given Congress almost unfettered power under that Commerce Clause to pass criminal statutes, anti-discrimination statutes, you name it, under the Commerce Clause. Now, that is a complete distortion of what the Commerce Clause actually means. So, unfortunately, we don't live in a world of economic freedom, but at least this case pushes back on the ability of a president to declare an emergency and give himself sweeping new powers to tax Americans, and two, negatively impact production and trade.
Wonder Freeman says, from what I hear, his mental state is in the Biden zone. I don't know about that, but that's a scary thought because, if Trump tells Netanyahu not to go into Haifa and then finds out that it's now a part of Israel, who knows what he might do.
Trump
So,
is saying to Iran, or saying to Israel, don't do anything with against Iranian nukes while I'm talking to everyone. Okay, God, how monstrous is that? But yeah, Trump, I think, is has his faculties and energy better than Biden did. But whether he has sound judgment is quite another matter altogether.
yeah. Yeah, he's scary either way, and in a sense, you know, it's not that he's if he's fully there mentally, it's not that he's acting on some sort of principle, and certainly not on any good principle. Yeah,
He
so
declares he's ignorant of the Constitution. They'll ask him, do you have to obey the Constitution here? And I don't know. Well, he took an oath twice now to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States as President of the United States. He doesn't even know what the Constitution says. He expresses repeatedly contempt for the document, total ignorance for the document. That in itself is scary. And we can see here why the courts have to engage in some pushback because he doesn't even understand existing due process law under the Supreme Court, and he is certainly doing unprecedented and sweeping new things using emergency powers. Declare an emergency, and I'm a dictator. I can do anything I want on it. And as you say, let's hope that he will obey the court's order here. The fact that he's asking for a stay, for example, of the injunction that this court issued against all of those tariffs shows that he's, at least in this case, trying to work within the judicial system. But we have a separation of powers, an independent judiciary that gets to rule on these things, Mr. Trump, whether you like it or not. And it does have the effect of sometimes thwarting you altogether or slowing you down, but that's the American system. Get over it, Mr. President. Read the Constitution. Become a little familiar with the Supreme Court cases interpreting that document. Whether I agree with those decisions or not is another matter. Jonathan is right. I mean, ideally, we would have no tariffs. Tariffs are a violation of rights, and they're horrible for the economy. And those two facts are intimately interrelated. But
well,
the 20th century saw an increasing willingness of the Supreme Court to grant Congress sweeping powers over the economy. But those powers are Congress's, not the president. He can't just seize those powers on his own. And what this case represents is judicial pushback on the idea that a president can just seize emergency powers and define them for himself, and according to him, not even have any judicial review of that.
Jonathan also says Americans don't want free trade anymore. It's been disparaged, and people are suspicious of it now. Well, in a sense, I'd say this is true, and it's more concerning in America when Americans move away from freedom than elsewhere because America is our last hope. But uh, Jonathan is the author of Price is Primary, and yeah, Price in a sense is going to be primary for Americans who go and try to buy things that are all of a sudden so much more expensive if tariffs go through. That they might think, well, what has changed? And they'll see what has changed is you had freer trade, and that has gone away, and now everything's more expensive. And yeah, some will put
Sometimes
two and two
we
together.
sometimes we need to suffer the consequences of bad policy to learn the lesson, or at least to relearn the lesson about free trade. And back in the 1920s, we had very high tariffs. Americans have, not been clear about economics for at least a century now in their public policy. But maybe Trump's tariffs have had the opposite effect of what he intended and gotten people to see, because you got the whole left now criticizing him on it, which is interesting, becoming, newfound pre-marketeers on the left, at least in certain quarters. And there's no one who can deny that this will have an inflationary impact. When you hear Trump saying to Walmart, eat the tariffs, uh, obviously that it violates their duty as to their shareholders. And they can only do that for so long. Either the product goes away or the price goes up eventually, Mr. Trump. And if people can see that with their own eyes, then Trump's attempt to do this stupid, immoral policy could indeed open more Americans' eyes on the importance of free trade and the negative impact it'll have on them personally and the economy.
Yeah, the eat the tariffs thing was despicable and really scary, scary enough that there's a policy, but so much scarier when politicians go like single out a company and go after that company. That to me is terrifying. I always think, I know this is several stages beyond where we are, but that video of uh was it Maduro, or was it was Maduro, I believe, walking down the street with, the camera on him, and he asks, "What's this?" And they say it's a private business, and he says expropriate it, and that's it. So yeah, this is I don't know. That's where that's where my mind goes with it. But thank you, Matt, for the super chat. Matt asks, "I'm curious to know if James is surprised by how awful Trump's second term has been, or if he was more or less expecting this." It's a very good question.
Well, Trump ran
As
on
well as a
tariffs.
brief overall assessment, if possible.
Well, Trump gave us tariffs, right? He didn't like NAFTA, and so he renegotiated the North America, with Canada and Mexico, whole new trade deals by threatening tariffs back in his first term, and he ran on it. Part of what the Trump people are saying is, look, the American people demanded this and sanctioned this when they voted Trump into office because he ran on tariffs. And he even told us how he was going to do it. He even suggested that he might use these emergency powers in doing it. So in that sense, I'm not surprised. What I was surprised at was the extent of it. My God, sweeping every nation in the world, huge tariffs here, huge tariffs there. Not as, I mean, tariffs would be the wrong instrument to cut off trade with China, in my view. But it's not even limited to just China, who's obviously a major, but he has respect for Xi. He has all kinds of admiration for Xi. He wants China to thrive and prosper under Xi. But the point is, wasn't targeted at all. He's now renegotiating the deals with Canada and Mexico that he negotiated in his first term. So I am surprised by the degree, but I'm not surprised by the fact.
Yeah, we never got to the taco question, which, I thought he said it's a nasty question. This time, I actually think it was a nasty question. I mean, if you're there and you want to ask that and you want an actual answer, you can ask it in a different way. But look, Trump is a nasty human being, and journalists have asked him perfectly legitimate questions, and he calls them stupid. And usually, I very rarely see him answering any tough questions. So that's, not a
Well,
justification, but
heaven help you if you ask a challenging question of Trump. Now you're, an idiot and you're fake news and you're all that. So no, although he's much more verbose than Biden, who hardly ever gave a press conference and answered questions. Trump is out there, flapjawing, yammering all the time. Unfortunately, he also is an expert at deriding questioners and evading questions he doesn't want to answer.
Frank asks, "Is there such a thing as a good dictator? I would vote for such a person." No, there isn't. And if he's a dictator, you can't vote for him anyway. Yeah,
No,
let's
there's
go the
no
other
such thing as a
direction.
good dictator. And
Yeah.
even if you could possibly imagine the best. Now, you're asking for a contradiction. I mean, it's like a square circle. But dictatorship itself is wrong. Now, I can't separate that from the consequences. Dictatorship is wrong because it hurts people, because it does violate individual rights. The dictatorship does violate individual rights. So, no, it can't be good. But even, you'd say you prefer it. That's what I want to understand. How do you square that circle? By imagining. How do you even imagine, 2 + 2 equaling 3? A good dictator. You say you'd be in favor of it? Really? You have contempt for your own freedom and the freedom of everyone else you're around? No, I live in a better world because I am free to pursue my values, and my neighbors are free. So I can take advantage of their minds and their productive activity in voluntary trade. A dictatorship would shut down the mind and make it so that I could not make my own choices and I could not take advantage of the intelligence and creativity of others through voluntary trade. So no, 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 no to every premise in the question.
Um, Yeah, Bonnie actually earlier said that the trolls aren't here in the chat today because we're not talking about Israel, but there is what I think is a troll, but people again be troll us grammatically so we can understand what you're saying. You know who's good buddies with Trump? Pierce Morgan. Yeah, that piece of shit is no longer pretending that he's not fully pro Hamas. He is his interview yesterday with the Israeli ambassador to Britain. Yeah, great. That's, you always bring the easiest people, Pierce, when you want to take somebody down from the pro-Israel side. So he interviewed the Israeli ambassador. Uh, and yeah, there is no more pretense there. Pierce Morgan, Hamas propagandist. That is the topic of today's episode of the reality show. I'm not going to be on, but I guarantee you, Mark Pellegrino, who is on, will swear almost as much as I would if I was on that episode. And I have plausible deniability since I won't be on. Thanks, James. Thanks, everybody, for watching. The reality show starts in a couple of minutes.
Be safe.